The book that I chose to do my book talk on is Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. This book is comprised of poems and it tells the story of Jacqueline's birth, her upbringing, and the journey of discovering her love for writing. However, before jumping into information about the book, I'd first like to talk a little bit about Jacqueline Woodson herself, because her background gives a lot of information that provides context to a lot of the issues that are discussed in the book. And although this book does act somewhat as a biography, there is information that Jacqueline shares on her website, which is where I've got the following information. First, I would like to discuss a little bit about how and where Jacqueline grew up. So she was born in Ohio, where she lived with her mother and her father, but when her parents separated, her mother moved her and her two older siblings down to South Carolina, and there they lived with Jacqueline's grandparents until they moved to New York City after her mother had another baby named Roman. Jacqueline has written over 100 novels, and this includes children's books, poetry books, young adult novels, as well as many adult fiction novels, and a list of all of her books can be found on her website, which is jacquelinewoodson.com. And in addition to writing so many novels, Jacqueline has also received many awards for her writing. She's received over 20 awards for the books that she's written, and there are even a few awards that she has won multiple times for different books. For Brown Girl Dreaming alone, Jacqueline received the National Book Award, the Newbery Honor Award, and the Coretta Scott King Award. Now that we know a little bit about Woodson, I would like to jump into Brown Girl Dreaming as a novel. And as I've stated, Brown Girl Dreaming acts a little bit as a biography for Woodson because it's the summary of her growing up as an African American in the 1960s and the 1970s. It says that she spent a lot of time in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, in Greenville, South Carolina with her grandparents. However, a lot of her childhood was also spent in New York City, where segregation was still very prevalent, but it was not as big a deal. In Brown Girl Dreaming, Jacqueline has a large emphasis on her family and how important they were to her. Later on, I will discuss a lot more of the characters, but because Jacqueline spent a lot of time with her grandparents, they were a big part of her life, as well as her siblings, and everyone shared in their struggles and their successes, and just the overall childhood was seen with a very close-knit family that is portrayed in this novel. Along with close family, Jacqueline also had incredible friendships, and she also had a lack of friendships at certain points in her life. When she was in South Carolina, the novel states that her grandparents did not want her to hang out with the neighborhood kids because they did not agree with some of the family values that the neighborhood kids had. However, when she moved to New York City, she became best friends with a girl named Maria, who was a Hispanic family, and they took Jacqueline into their family, and there's accounts where it says that she feels like she was a part of their family, which I think is a beautiful representation of friendship. As well as with family and friendship, the summary of Brown Girl Dreaming also includes the development of Jacqueline's love for writing. We obviously know that Jacqueline is a writer because she wrote this book, and the interesting development of her love for writing is discovered a little bit more as we dive into the character development of Jacqueline herself. Jacqueline is the main character of this novel, as the novel is telling the story of her upbringing. The main developments that we see in Jacqueline is her love for writing. It says that she would tell many stories to her family and to her friends and just make them up as she went. She had a huge imagination, and her family would kind of call her out and say, hey, you can't make up stories, and was that one of your other made up lies, and simply wrote her imagination off as lies. But in the 5th grade, she had a teacher look at the story that she made up and wrote down in a poem and called it writing. And once she had this affirmation of her skill, she understood that her lies weren't just storytelling, that they were something that she could create. She actually shared a poem in the book on page 311 called A Writer. A small excerpt from that poem is, "You're a writer," Miss Vivo says, holding my poem out to me, and standing in front of the class, taking my poem from her, my voice shakes as I recite the first line. Black brothers, black sisters, all of them were great. But my voice grows stronger with each word because more than anything else in the world, I want to believe her. As well as the affirmation of her love for writing, Jacqueline is also developed because of her relationships that she had, primarily with her grandfather and with her friend Maria. They were both very important relationships in her life, and she grew to be more like those people as her character developed. Her grandfather was one of the most important people to her, and she actually called her grandfather Daddy. And because once her father and her mother divorced, they left Ohio and she lived with her grandparents. And so her dad was not around, and her grandfather took on this fatherly role that was so beautiful, and he would take the kids places and they would curl up in his lap at night and he would read them stories and he would call them his kids. But as the story progresses, there's also a development of Daddy's sickness. It says that he was a smoker and he got very sick and he would cough a lot, and at times he couldn't even get out of bed because he was so sick. But despite all of this sickness, it says that Daddy was always home to Jacqueline. So when she was up in New York, she would get homesick and she would think of all the beautiful things in South Carolina, and then she would lastly think of being with Daddy and being in his arms, and it made her feel like that is what home actually is. So it was Daddy passed away at the end of the novel. It was very heartbreaking, and although that was the final development of Daddy's character, a lot of things changed in Jacqueline's life because of his absence. A few other very important relationships in the novel are Maria, which is Jacqueline's best friend, and as I mentioned, is still her best friend to this day, as well as her siblings, which were Hope, her oldest brother, Dell, her older sister, and Roman, her younger brother. And it says that her relationships with them were so different because Hope and Dell were very intelligent, and Jacqueline did not see herself as intelligent. And Roman was a young baby, so there was not a lot of character development of Roman. However, they seemed to be a lot closer than she was with Hope and Dell. There is also the relationships and the characters of her mother and her father. Her mother is mentioned a lot more than her father because her mother was present and her father was not present after they divorced. It actually says that she did not see her father again until she was 14 years old, but she felt as though when she saw her father again that a puzzle piece just fell into her life because there was parts of her personality that she did not understand, and she was finally able to understand them when she met her father again. But her mother was such a caring woman and was always there for their family and did everything she could to be the mom that the kids needed. In addition to her parents, her grandmother and her aunts and her uncles were also important characters in the story because there was a big emphasis on family. She did not grow as close to her grandmother as she did her grandfather, but they were still very important characters in the story. Some themes that were present in Brown Girl Dreaming are self-discovery, belonging, and religion. And I would like to dig a little bit into these themes and read a few excerpts from the book that show these themes. There is a poem called Other People's Memory, and it's found on page 17 and 18. And it is simply a poem that recounts the story of Jacqueline's birth. And it's like she's asking her mother, her father, her grandmother, and her grandfather about her birth, and they all have different accounts of it. So she has all of these different memories, and she's still not entirely sure who she is. But then there's this poem called Stevie and Me, and it's found on page 227 and 228. It says that she's walking through a library and she picks up a book and it has a boy on it. The name of the book is Stevie, and she begins to read it. And it says, "If someone had taken that book out of my hand and said, 'You're too old for this,' maybe I'd never have believed that someone who looked like me can be in the pages of the book, that someone who looked like me had a story." This self-discovery moment was so beautiful to her because she found out that she too could have a story. And the final poem that I would like to look at that shows her self-discovery is entitled "The Bushwick History Lesson." And it's simply a poem about Bushwick Avenue and how it got its name, and there was many different cultures there, and it made her understand that she didn't just appear one day, that she didn't just wake up and know how to write her name, because she knew that she was a long time coming, that she discovered who she was. Another theme that presents itself is the theme of belonging, and there is a poem entitled "At the End of the Day" on page 53 and 54, and it's her grandfather telling about how he goes to work and he does not feel like he fits in, and there's segregation, but then when he comes back home to Nickeltown, he feels at home because there's people like him. And she says at the end of the poem, "This evening I am happy to belong to Nickeltown." And there's a lot of things like this in this story because they feel like they don't belong as African Americans in the South. But there's one in particular called Mrs. Hughes' House, where she's going to a daycare, and she says that she's sticking out because she was in the city and now she's back in South Carolina, and she feels like she doesn't belong there because she's going back and forth from one home to another home. A final poem that embodies the theme of belonging is entitled "What Everybody Knows Now," and it's just a recount of them walking through the streets after segregation laws have been lifted, and they still don't necessarily feel like they belong there, that they can't go into places where the laws were present. The final theme that sticks out is the theme of religion, and this theme is mentioned all throughout the book because her family is Jehovah's Witness. There is a poem entitled "The Other Infinity" that simply talks about eternal life, and if they do good things, then they can reach eternal life. There is a poem entitled "Because We're Witnesses," and it's saying that there's this long list of things that they cannot do. There's no Halloween, there's no war, there's no celebrating America's flag because they're Jehovah's Witnesses and they cannot partake in these things. And then the final poem that I would like to point out is a poem entitled "Eve and the Snake," and it's simply Jacqueline's recount of what happened in the garden when Eve was tempted by the snake. My assessment of this book is that it was a very interesting topic to read the poems of somebody who grew up during the civil rights movement, who developed as a writer, who learned to be who they wanted to be, who learned that they could dream no matter what, was a beautiful thing to read about. And it was also very interesting to just observe the growth of Jacqueline as she moved around, as she learned who she was, as she learned to belong, and as she learned that her family was so important. Because every story that you read really did show the importance of her family. Something that intrigued me about Jacqueline Woodson's writing style is that it was a poetry book. A lot of poetry books are standalone poems. However, this poetry book told a story. Instead of being one thing at a time, it genuinely told the story of her life and how she grew up. I would definitely recommend this book to young adults. I think that it's relatable, that it's something that would challenge you as a reader. It could be shared in a classroom because it's so intentional with what it says. After viewing this book talk, there are a few things that I would like you to consider. Do you believe that this novel is relatable? Do you think that this novel could be defined as literature? And finally, do you think that this novel could be used in a classroom setting? Thank you.